How you doing this morning? I have a question to ask you. How's your heart doing? Check your pulse. Make sure you've got a pulse. I'd like to take you down a road today that I've been traversing myself for a period of time. And it doesn't have to do with a clinical look at your heart. It has to do with the emotional look at your heart. Because what I've begun to realize is that the heart of the problem often is the problem with the heart. And as Joseph suggested, if we want to change the world, we've got to change behavior. But if we want to change behavior, you've got to change your heart. Now, I'd like to go to one of the world's most renowned psychiatrists. Have you ever heard of Lucy? Anybody know who Lucy is? Okay, turn to your neighbor. If they don't know who Lucy is, you're going to have to explain that quickly. We're talking about Lucy of Peanuts fame, right? The Peanut comic strip, Lucy. How many got it? I should have surveyed you on this. And I'm going to share a classic Peanut strip cartoon that was first published on January 16, 1960. And I'm going to give you the generic version of this. There are going to be 4 basic frames, and there are going to be 3 people. We're going to be dealing with Lucy, the famous psychiatrist, who is giving advice to Linus, who is having a heart problem. And of course, there's Charlie Brown in the background who's listening in to all of this, and he's going to give his famous comment that he usually gives. So let's walk through this to see what Lucy might be able to do for Linus here. All right? So, Linus suggests, Lucy, I don't want my heart to be half love and half hate. And then in desperation, he turns and he looks to her and he said, I want my heart to be all love. Ever felt like Linus? Ever sensed that there are times with difficult people that you see this half and half? And of course, Lucy comes back with some great advice. She says, good for you, Linus. All you have to do to solve this problem is learn to lean a little bit to one side. And then she says, you see, now that love will get a chance to spill over into the hate. What great advice. Learn to lean a little so that the love spills over into the hate. And of course, we have Charlie Brown who's listening in the background, and here's what he really thinks of this. Good grief. Okay. But I'm going to suggest that Lucy is on target here. If you want to change your heart, you've got to learn to lean. And so what I'd like you to do this morning as we move forward is to participate with one of Linus's challenge. I want you to kind of put yourself in Linus's shoes here, and I want you to think of someone who is really challenging in your life. Anybody can think of somebody who's really challenging in your life? Okay, the rest of you who are not raising your hands are lying right now, but let's dig down a little bit deeper, okay? Someone who you privately think is a jerk. Okay, you know that left-hand column that we often talk about. And what I'd like you to do is weigh in on this. So I'd like you to grab your remotes, and on a jerk scale, okay, 1 being normal, 5 a complete jerk, I'd like you to take a moment to weigh in. But before you do, I'll tell you when to weigh in here. I ran into some interesting research a number of months ago. There was an 8th grader who decided to do a science project. J.J. Murphy decided to study idiots and jerks. And he created a jerkometer, okay, that ranges from normal to idiot to total idiot to jerk to complete jerk. So with your difficult person in mind, I'd like you to get your number that would correspond how jerky they really are, and let me have you weigh in. Take it away. Wow. So we have some jerks, some total jerks, and some complete jerks, all right? How do you handle difficult people? You know the answer. If you know anything about crucial conversations and crucial accountability, we're going to suggest to people that you have to what? You got to start with heart. Here's the challenge. How do I stay focused upon what I really want? Because when you look at our model, really the heart of the model is simply finding a way to influence myself to engage in these skills differently. In fact, I tell people this. If you miss this section on Start with Heart and you flawlessly execute every single strategy in crucial conversations or crucial accountability, it will feel to the other person that you're manipulating them. This is about changing deeply the motives that you are challenged with in dealing with difficult people. Now, here's the reason. Let me give you a quote from a great book called The Anatomy of Peace here. Notice, a culture of change can never be created by behavioral strategy alone. Peace, whether at home, work, or between people, is only invited when an intelligent outward strategy is married to a peaceful inward one. This is why we spend most of our time working to improve ourselves at the deepest level. Now get this, if you don't change your heart, and if you don't get your heart right, your strategy won't matter that much. Because there's a disconnect between the authenticity of where my heart is and the skill that I'm trying to influence you with. Once we get our hearts right, however, outward strategies matter a lot if we get our hearts right. And of course, we know that one of the ways that we get our hearts right is we begin having people engage in a strategy to ask themselves, what do I really want? What do I want for me, for you, for the relationship, for the organization? But I want to go a little bit deeper here because I'm going to suggest to you that there is a significant difference between what I want and what I really want, especially when I am dealing with difficult people. My jerk, my idiot, my moron. So what we're going to do in the short time that we have left is we're going to learn some of Lucy's leaning strategies. Leaning heart strategies. How do I dig deeper in terms of what I really want and have an influence? 3 strategies we're going to look at. First of all, how to recognize how our history haunts us. Secondly, we're going to look at how do you connect through caring? How do you care when I don't care? And lastly, how do you end up doing the healing thing rather than the easy thing? So let's start with our first strategy here, recognizing how our history haunts us. One of the challenges that we have when dealing with difficult people is the fact that we fail to recognize how this history, our history with this other person, is woven intricately into the fabric of separateness. How that history is often embedded within the mortar of the walls that separate us and alienate us. I call these the Cold War walls. Let me give you an example of what this is about based upon some research that was done a number of years ago. In fact, in 1989, the German wall fell. The Cold War was over. And yet there were a number of fences that existed in separating Czechoslovakia from Germany. And during the Cold War, there were electrified fences. And in this particular area, right now, for the last 25 years, since the wall has fallen, is one of the biggest nature preserves that exists. But there's one species that is boycotting crossing the border. And scientists in 2012 started doing something interesting. They started putting collars on red deer that would give them a GPS tracking. And to the point in time, a number of years ago, they had tracked 11,000 GPS settings, locations where these deer had gone, and yet very few, if any, had ever crossed that line where the fence once stood. The fence has been down for 25 years. And yet they found that even their offspring that were not around when that electric fence existed will not cross that demarcation. Isn't that interesting? What's the lesson, perhaps? Maybe the deer are teaching us this lesson that it takes a lot longer to take fences down than it does to build them up. And that maybe building a fence up or tearing it down ultimately depends upon your leaning strategy, to quote Lucy. Am I allowing love to spill over into that hate, or am I allowing hate to spill over into that love? What am I doing? The Cold War effect is simply this, that our hearts here, when we have this fence between us and other people, don't just keep other people out, but they fence ourselves in because we start leaning in the wrong direction. How do we begin to change that? One of the ways I'm going to suggest that we prevent our history from haunting us is learning to connect by caring. How do you care? I know you've had this from probably some of your respondents in class. Ever had somebody come up when you're teaching crucial conversations and say, yeah, but you don't understand. The person that I'm dealing with is not reasonable, they're not rational, and they're not decent. You've all had that. And we come up with an answer, well, just keep trying a little harder. I'm going to say you got to try a little deeper. You've got to find a way to connect with them and care when you don't care. Now, a number of years ago, I happened to have the privilege of being on a college campus, and there was a gentleman who came through and gave a series of talks that deeply impacted me, and I began putting something together that has helped me learn to care when I don't care and find a way to connect. And so what I've put together is something called a care continuum. Now, when you look at this continuum, what we're talking about is this concept of mutuality, the concept that I see a connection between myself and even the thorniest of people, those people who tend to be jerks and morons, at least behaviorally. How do I begin to impact that? Well, at one end of this continuum is what I would call fondness. Fondness, I believe, is a pure function of emotion. So here's a question that I want you to turn to your neighbor and answer yes or no. Can you force people to be fond of you? Turn to your neighbor, yes or no. How many believe that you can force someone to be fond of you? All right, those people, we're running a special session for you after this, okay? Feel free to step in. No, you can't. That's ridiculous. But on the other end of the continuum is something that I would call kindness or civility. And kindness and civility is not about the emotion, it is about will. And the interesting thing about willpower is this. You see, I can choose to be kind to you even when I don't like you. It's not a matter of emotionally liking you. I'm choosing to treat you kindly. Now, I asked Dr. Pravancha, this gentleman who came through our college campus and gave these talks, how do you do that? And he said, Stace, sometimes you have to separate the person from the act that they've committed. And by doing that, you begin to prevent the history from haunting you, and you find a way to connect. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, human beings basically have two ways of interacting with others that are challenging in their life. First of all, they can react to others based upon the conditions. In other words, based upon the act. So you're driving down the road, somebody pulls in front of you, practically takes the bumper off. What's your reaction to that? Blessings on thee, go thy way? Probably not. You question their ancestry, whatever it may be, okay? And we react based upon what they have done. He says there's a different way to handle this, and you can learn to respond to others not based upon the conditions, but based upon your convictions. How do you believe another person should be treated? How should they be handled when they have perhaps treated you poorly? It's a challenging thing to do, but it's part of that leaning strategy of learning how to allow love to spill over into hate. and to begin to change. There's someone who gave us a tremendous example of this for the entire world, and unfortunately, we lost him last year. Because he taught us how to do the healing thing, not the easy thing. And his name was Nelson Mandela. This is Robben Island, where Mandela spent 18 of his 27 years in prison. And every day he had a choice to make based upon his history, based upon the walls that were separating him, based upon his willingness to connect with other people, as to whether he was going to lean toward hate and revenge, or whether he was going to lean towards love. And one of the things that Mandela found was this, and he talks about this in his book. He says, all men, even the most seemingly cold-blooded, have a core of decency if their hearts are touched. They're capable of changing. In fact, legend has it that as Mandela walked out of the prison that day after spending 27 years of his life behind bars, behind walls, that a friend of his turned to him and said, now it's time for revenge. And Mandela turned back to him and said, they have had my body for 27 years. They won't have my mind for another 27 seconds. And Mandela leaned a little farther, and he generated something called the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. And if you have never read some of the transcript of the Truth and Reconciliation hearings, you need to do it. It is absolutely life-changing. Because what he discovered at that moment in the history of his own life, in the history of his own heart, in the history of South Africa, is that what South Africa needed was healing even more than they needed justice. And he chose to do the healing thing rather than retribution and retaliation. In fact, when he was elected president, he even invited onto the inaugural platform the guard that had been his guard for years. That's a leaning. That's a dramatic leaning. So I'm going to suggest to you this, that Nelson Mandela perhaps has left to you and to me one of the greatest legacies, and this perhaps was his greatest legacy. He was a master leaner. Now, you and I are studying perhaps to facilitate better in the next couple of days, maybe even learn to become a master facilitator, but I've got to be honest with you. While I want to be a master facilitator, I realize that I can't do that until I've learned to be a master leaner. Because this is about heart. So I'm going to invite you on this journey with me. As I see you in the next couple of days, if you see me leaning, you'll know it's nothing personal. I may be working on somebody else. But I share Linus's frustration. I am tired of living with a divided heart. I want my love to start spilling out. My friends, we live in a world with tremendous hate. And as Joseph said, all it takes is one person in your sphere of influence to start leaning a little bit differently to touch the heart of that challenging person, that difficult person. Someone has suggested that hurt people hurt people. And what hurt people need is not so much justice. They need healing. And you and I can be agents of that healing because, as the old song said years ago, what the world needs now is love, sweet love, and it starts with heart. Thank you very much.